Ryan Sato is going to introduce our guest speaker. Ryan. I saw you earlier. There you are. We're on.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I have fond memories of being with you at the Rushton Lectures last October at Port Williams United Baptist. So I know that room, and it's nice to see you all. And then know that there are others joining us from across the country, which is very exciting. So greetings from the West. I'm going to do a short, extra little introduction for the Reverend Dr. Allan Effa, who's speaking today. And I'll simply say this. One of the best things I did in my first 4 years of ministry at First Baptist Edmonton was get Allan Effa to join the congregation of First Baptist Edmonton. And we totally stole him away from the North American Baptists. I joke, but there's a lot of truth there, a lot of truth in jest. We Baptists know we're all on the same team, but it was fun to get Allan Effa and his wife Karen to join the membership of First Baptist Edmonton way back in 2011. And I'll say that his heart for worship and spiritual formation and justice and compassion and care is the real deal. And he really exemplifies what we talk about at First Baptist Edmonton. We say we want to joyfully follow Jesus for the good of the world. And Allan is such a great example and a mentor and a model to us on that. And a fun fact is that Allan also has a talent for doing parodies of Barry Manilow songs. So I can't get into that right now, but maybe if you have a side conversation with him sometime, you can talk about his devotion and penchant for Barry Manilow music. Other than that, I'll say that what a delight it is to have him as a member of First Baptist Edmonton, but I am also blessed to be able to call him friend and spiritual companion on the journey. So I commend to you with joy and delight the Reverend Dr. Allan Effa.
Thank you, Ryan. It was not a difficult steal to get me to come to First Baptist. In many ways, I feel like I was a refugee, and you embraced me and received me and empowered me and befriended me. And it's been a great, great delight these past 13 years. In fact, in some ways, I think you saved my faith and faith in the church. And so I've really enjoyed being part of that. Thank you for the invitation. I know you had a role in getting me invited. So thank you, Ryan, for putting my name out there and for the invitation to come and join you today on a topic that I'm very passionate about. Appreciated to get to know Reverend Arla Johnson through the devotional. I watched your ordination service. I'm intrigued by your title as Minister of Inclusive Community. I don't know if you coined that, but that is just amazing. I wish I could see more staff positions across our country to have that kind of a name. Now, I don't think this is not going to be a huge how-to session with 40 days of how to become an inclusive, diverse church. I don't have magical tools or solutions to offer to you, but I will, because each context is very unique. But I am going to talk about some images and metaphors that should stimulate your thinking about how we can become more of an accepting, embracing, inclusive church that reflects our changing Canada. So I'm going to share some slides because I know how hard it is to watch a talking head, especially after lunch. And it's hard to stay alert and just watch me speaking. So if I have permission to share slides, I will do that in just a moment. My very first pastoral appointment was a small rural church in South Dakota, and they were mostly dairy farmers. And so after milking the cows every morning, then on Sundays they got up, of course, at 5:30 to milk the cows, and they'd come to church and had a nice breakfast, and the building was warm. And my dear brothers often fell asleep on the pew. And as a young preacher who was trying to learn to be a pastor and a seminarian, I sometimes felt frustrated by the fact that my parishioners were asleep. One Sunday morning, a light fixture fell off the roof, off the ceiling of the church, right during the middle of my sermon, landed smack between two rather drowsy farmers, and of course shattered into thousands of pieces and woke them up very abruptly. And I think it was an inspiration from God that I didn't continue my sermon. I stopped. I walked over there. We had a word of prayer. We thanked God that no one was seriously injured by the accident. And then I went back on and continued the sermon. And believe me, they were quite alert after that point on. It was delightful. Anyway, let me share a few slides with you. I need to get permission, though, to do that first. Someone can, who's the technician here, can give me permission to share slides? Right now, I don't have that permission.
Hey, Allan, you should be able to share your slides now.
Now I can do it. Okay, here we are. Coming up. All right. One of the things I love doing in my teaching is sharing paintings, pieces of art that help us to enter into a particular topic and that bring our hearts and minds together. And so one of my favorite painters, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Sigurd Köder, one of the best German artists of specifically Christian art in the 20th century, born in 1925 in Germany. He was a soldier in World War II, sent to the French front, where he was captured as a frontline soldier, became a prisoner of war. But once he was returned from captivity, he attended the Academy School of Art in Stuttgart until 1951, studying carving and silversmithing, as well as painting and art history. And after 12 years of teaching art and working as an artist, Köder undertook theological studies for the priesthood. And in 1971, he was ordained a Catholic priest. He went on to serve for 20 years. And he exercised his ministry as a parish priest, but continued also to produce works of art. Actually, it was his most prolific time. And there's a complete synergy between Father Köder being a minister and an artist. And he uses his paintings as Jesus used his parables. And he reveals the depth of Christian message through metaphors, sharing light and color on life and human history. Some of it's even colored a bit by his experience during the war and the time of the Holocaust. So let me share just these few words from Mark. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." The title of this painting is "All Are Welcome." Now, Köder painted very startling paintings featuring childlike simplicity of the characters and depicting Jesus by reflection rather than description. So you don't actually see Jesus in this painting or in many of his paintings. We see people around the table looking at him. And as a viewer, it looks very much like they're looking at us. We are the person through whom Jesus is practicing radical welcome. In Mark 2, Jesus isn't hosting this meal. His hospitality, so to speak, is to enjoy the hospitality of others. Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners. This was not accidental, but a purpose of engagement, because Jesus announced, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now let's take a little tour of this meal of sinners. This actual painting hangs in the dining hall of a theological college in Rome. So before Köder painted it, he asked students, who would be at the Lord's table today? And then he painted. First of all, notice all the different hands in this close-up. There's a closeness and intimacy in the sharing. Jesus, the host, extends his hands in sharing and blessing toward all who have been drawn around the table. The first disciple on the left is a pious Jew, a religious person who would probably not find it easy to be in such company. In fact, in the story in Mark, we read about the Pharisees who were scandalized at Jesus's behavior and his associations. There's a close-up of him. Next to the pious-looking man is a woman wearing a low-cut dress, lots of makeup, dark, sad eyes. She's often identified with the prostitutes whom Jesus associated with. Next to the woman with a low-cut dress is a woman bent over, elderly. She's obviously poor. Maybe she's so crippled with arthritis, it's hard for her to lift her head. Some have suggested she is a beggar. Certainly, she would find herself among the lowest rung of society. The flower seems placed directly in front of her, a gift of beauty to someone who has seen so little goodness. At the far end of the table is a clown figure, a misfit, the socially awkward person. Some have suggested perhaps transgendered, not one that might typically be invited to this kind of gathering. And then to the right is the scholar or the scientist, the one who might find it difficult to believe is also welcome at this table. Next to him sits a wealthy woman. She's distinguished by her dress, the netting on her forehead, the ring on her finger. Finally, there is the stranger, the ethnic minority, most likely an immigrant and even possibly a refugee, bearing a wounded and bandaged right hand and arm. Perhaps we might think of him as a migrant farm worker, someone on the outskirts of society looking in. His facial expression is one of wonder and surprise at being invited to join this table fellowship. Now here's where Köder goes even deeper in his parable style, because on the back wall, you may have noticed these etchings. They're actually an etching of the prodigal son with the father embracing the son on the right. And next to the prodigal son and the father is the older brother, who is scandalized at the father's graceful welcome of the son. And so Köder brilliantly puts together this painting of the welcoming table together with the story of the prodigal son, with rejection and reconciliation in the same room as Jesus dining with such a motley group, showing the link between Jesus's indiscriminate dining companions and the extravagant love of the Father. Notice that they dine with the door wide open. The invitation stands for anyone to come, regardless of their story or their background. Another detail catches the mind or catches the eye. Do you see the stones lying on the threshold? What do you think is the significance of this? The only way to enter the room and take a seat at the table is by, first of all, laying down our stones of condemnation, our attitudes of superiority or judgment. Too often the church has been more interested in policing virtue and deciding who is in and who should be kept out, that we bear little resemblance to the lavish and generous posture of welcome of our Lord. It does no good to answer that we truly do care for sinners, but we just want to see them repent before we hang out with them. That was precisely the attitude and the posture of the scribes and the Pharisees. They longed to see repentance and restoration on the part of sinners, but their method was to shun them into repentance, avoiding their contaminating presence. Jesus didn't merely desire their repentance. He goes to them, walks among them, sits and eats with them. The Chinese Filipino-American missiologist Santos Yao wrote a fascinating article that I have used in some of my courses. It's entitled, "The Table Fellowship of Jesus with the Marginalized, a Radical Inclusiveness." You could make a strong argument that the table fellowship is a prominent theme in the Bible. Someone has said that you can eat your way through the pages of the Bible. The story begins with trouble at dinner time in the garden and ends with a multicultural feast at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And there's an awful lot of eating in the pages in between. Yao demonstrates how the social structure in Jewish society in the time of Jesus was basically group-oriented. In such context, the people's main source of identity was derived from belonging to a strongly bonded group. Consequently, the group exerted immense pressure upon the individual to conform to its patterns and definitions of acceptable social behavior. Strong group identity was maintained by carefully determining those people who could or one could not share meals with. Table fellowship was a powerful boundary marker that reinforced exclusiveness and otherness. During the 8 years I lived and worked as a Baptist missionary in rural Nigeria, I saw how society was structured by noticing who ate with whom. When I visited the homes of families, I shared food with the male host, while the wife or wives and children ate in the kitchen. At our large annual Bible conference gatherings that brought together sometimes up to 2,000 people, a cow or a bull was butchered, and we were all divided up into groups and assigned places where we would receive meals. There were the ordained pastors and missionaries who always got the choicest pieces of meat. The non-ordained pastors, the deacons, the pastors' wives, the older men, the younger men, younger women, older women, and finally the children, all in their various groupings to share their meals. But when we partook of the Lord's Supper, there was a leveling of all the barriers, no distinctions of ethnicity, age, gender, or status. We all shared the same elements in the same place and time. It was a powerful witness of the new people of God that was being formed since Pentecost. And Jesus consistently defied the status quo. He surprised the Samaritan woman by asking her for a drink. The Gospels often depict him in a meal setting, freely dining with and offering table fellowship to all classes of people. Jesus engaged in what Yao calls a provocative theater. You see, he wasn't just teaching about the kingdom, he was acting out the new reality of this kingdom, where his boundary-breaking actions were demonstrations of how this kingdom was actually breaking in already. And this, of course, got him into all kinds of trouble with those in society who wanted to preserve the current social order. The religious leaders sought to cast him in a negative light by labeling him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yao goes so far to suggest that it was Jesus's violation of sacred social boundaries that inflamed much of the opposition, ultimately leading to his destruction. Yao also points out details in the eating stories that I had not noticed before. I knew that all four of the Gospels record the story of the feeding of the 5,000, but Yao tells us that the Synoptic Gospels place it immediately after the story of the death of John the Baptist, which took place in the context of a banquet. The Gospel writers are painting a deliberate contrast between the banquet of Herod, where there was pride, arrogance, scheming, and even murder, and Jesus's banquet of healing, trust, and sharing. You may know that the feeding of the 4,000 is recorded in Matthew and Mark and is placed in Decapolis, a region primarily settled by Gentiles. The gospel writers seem to include this story deliberately to show that the blessings of the kingdom are intended for Gentiles as well as Jews. The leftovers are collected in Gentile baskets, a different term than the wicker baskets used to pick up the remains after the feeding of the 5,000. All who eat with Jesus receive a share of the divine blessings that is communicated through the process of eating and drinking. Sharing a table means sharing life. Saskatchewan-born Roman Catholic theologian Ron Rolheiser notes that in the Gospels, we see that Jesus's passion for inclusivity virtually always trumps his concern for purity and worthiness. In fact, Jesus turned the notions of purity upside down. The prevailing culture assumed that one became contaminated and impure by having too close contact with people who were impure. Jesus saw the power flowing the other direction. Instead of the clean becoming unclean through association with the impure, he believed that the power of purity could redeem and cleanse those he came into contact with. The table fellowship of Jesus with social outcasts levels the playing field of discipleship, where the marginals and the oppressed are welcomed without any qualification. It's an egalitarianism that includes both the oppressors and the oppressed. The tax collectors who serve the occupying powers of empire, and the fishermen who have had many unfriendly dealings with tax collectors in the past, along with a revolutionary zealot who entertains an anti-empire political agenda. All are called to share the blessings from the same table as his followers. Such a polarized group of followers, and Jesus kept them somehow together. Jesus turns the meal into an active demonstration of the kingdom that announces God's embrace of all peoples. He's canceling the social boundaries set up to demarcate the us from the them. This kingdom reality was one of the most difficult principles to live out in practice by the church of the first century. And guess what? 21st century, we still struggle, don't we? We have just celebrated the Feast of Pentecost, the gift of the Spirit to all believers, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or social position. And we get this idyllic description of community life post-Pentecost in Acts 2, 46 to 47, where it says, day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the good will of the people. And you have to stop and ask, is this a factual description of reality or a statement of an ideal? Maybe for a thin slice of time, it actually happened that way. But the tongues of fire were barely smoldering when the first serious conflict arose. And it was because of prejudice and favoritism in the distribution of food. It appears that special provisions were being made for the Hebrew-speaking widows, while the Greek-speaking ones were being neglected or overlooked. The boundaries of language and degree of cultural assimilation somehow survived the fire and zeal of Pentecost with all of its warm kumbaya sentimentalities. The next big church crisis revolved around circumcision, but also largely around Jews and Gentiles eating together. And this required a major church council to find a way forward so that some degree of unity within an increasingly diversifying church could be preserved. Peter played an important role in building consensus. Yet despite Peter's vision at Joppa and his paradigm-shifting encounter with Cornelius and his household, we see him later vacillating on the matter as he avoided dining with Gentiles to avoid criticism from his more conservative Jewish friends. He succumbed to powerful peer pressure in order to preserve social homogeneity. Two of the major problems affecting the Corinthian church were around the matter of food. The first was the division between those who felt it was okay to eat food sacrificed to idols and those who had a problem with the notion. It was a dispute over a relatively minor matter that polarized the church into separate camps. A bit reminiscent of the way mask wearing polarized some of our churches during the recent COVID pandemic. Have we made any progress? The other one was the strong social division between rich and poor. The societal pattern of segregation by class, so prevalent in Corinth, creeped into the church, whereby the very love feast that was to signal the erasing of barriers became an occasion of exclusion and reinforcement of group identity. Instead of mimicking the old patterns of grouping in society, Paul calls them to recognize the body of the Lord before partaking of the bread and cup. That is to say, to affirm the unity we all have as members baptized into the same body and truly reflect the radical message of the gospel. I began teaching at Taylor Seminary after studying at Fuller Theological Seminary. During the 1980s and early 90s, Fuller was known for its Institute of Church Growth. So when I was assigned courses at Taylor Seminary, one of those was a course on church growth. Donald McGavran, considered the father of the church growth movement, did his research in India, and he noticed that the social structure of the country was very tightly bounded, and that there was little movement or contact from one group to another. When the gospel flourished in one social group, it did not spread to surrounding groups because of the insularity of their society, especially the caste system. So McGavran came up with the homogeneous unit principle, which states, this principle states that it is easier for people to become Christians when they must cross few or no racial, linguistic, or class barriers. The science behind this is fairly sound and offers some important guidelines for strategically reaching various people groups. But McGavran never intended this to be taken as a kingdom principle, nor as a justification for homogeneity within the church. Some North American church planters appropriated this notion and came up with profiles of their target groups. So they tailored church plants so as to cater to a specific demographic group. Most famous of these was Saddleback Sam. Maybe some of you remember this. Rick Warren's attempt to plant the Saddleback Community Church. They created this profile. Well-educated, thinks he's enjoying life more now than he did 5 years ago, self-satisfied, even smug about his station in life. Notice it's all he. He prefers the casual and the informal over the formal, overextended in both time and money, skeptical of organized religion, would rather be in a large group than a small one. Health and fitness are high priorities for himself and his family. He likes where he lives. He likes his job. He is well educated. When you create such a profile, it's pretty clear. It's actually laughable, isn't it? But it's pretty clear who is being excluded or overlooked. It's so laughable to contrast this with the very wide range of people Jesus sought out and his preferential option for the lowest members of society. Busy, successful, overcommitted Saddleback Sam is likely to be among those who make excuses for not coming to the kingdom banquet in the parable of Luke 14, in which the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame are invited to come and dine. But let's move on from table fellowship to another image and consider its implications for the church in our increasingly diverse Canada. And this is the phrase in the title of this lecture: enlarge the site of your tent. Isaiah 54:2, enlarge the site of your tent. Let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. This is the text chosen by the recent Vatican Synodal consultation, intended to spur missional thinking among Catholics around the globe as they consider what this might look like in their particular context. Now, if you read the entire chapter, in all honesty, this is one of those texts that, like Jeremiah 29:11, are often lifted out of their context and applied with little consideration to their original intent. Now, while 2nd Isaiah sometimes offers a radical universal vision of the ingathering of nations, this verse is addressed to exiles or recent returnees who have experienced a sharp population decline and loss of land. They were a harassed minority group that barely escaped extinction. And so it's a promise of flourishing, a message of hope. Perhaps they thought back to their worship center, originally located in a tent or tabernacle, the tent of meeting, a tent on the move with the people during their wilderness wanderings. Enlarging it would make room for the ingathering of more people. Or it might hearken back to the ancient pastoral nomadic days when the patriarchs lived in tents in the Judean wilderness. The tent was a place of refuge where guests and strangers could be assured of welcome in a hostile environment. Pastoral nomads in the ancient Middle East and Bedouins to this day viewed hospitality as a sacred duty to any wanderer who might come by. The desert was a dangerous place where food and water were scarce. The night brought cold temperatures, and bands of criminals made their living off of harassing travelers and raiding caravans. Abram's hospitality to the 3 strangers might come to mind to a Judean reader of the text. Coupled with the command to enlarge the tent is a promise of population increase and of territorial gain. Possessing the nations and settling the desolate towns are listed as ways in which the tent is to be expanded. This passage could be and is probably used by contemporary Zionists to justify the expansion of Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian land. Such a mindset also guided the Portuguese and Spanish explorers who received the blessing of the church to go and Christianize the world through military force and subjugation of indigenous peoples. There are many ways this text can be used in an oppressive and non-life-giving manner. Nevertheless, the metaphor of the tent is a helpful one as we consider the church's mission in Canada today. If we engage in that mission in a Jesus way and see the expansion of the tent as something that results from intentional invitation rather than conquest or coercion. We took very modest vacations when our children were young, either staying at Karen's parents' lake cabin or camping in our large family-sized tent. Camping trips seem to bring the greatest joy and bonding as a family. I can still recall the fun nights of crawling into sleeping bags, talking and laughing about the events of the day, sharing stories and silly games, and making shadow puppets on the tent walls with our flashlights. Sometimes our girls brought a friend along to camp with us, and for a few days, it was like they became part of our family. About 12 years ago, Karen and I joined a one-week organized bicycle tour from Jasper to Canmore, Alberta. Most of the 20 or so people in our group were strangers to us. But in the process of making meals and sleeping in tents together, we quickly formed a deep friendship bond. It was one of the best trips of our life. The tent is a space of communion, a place of participation, and of deep inclusion. Eugene Peterson in The Message translates it this way: clear lots of ground for your tents. Make your tents large, spread out, think big, use plenty of rope, drive the tent pegs deep. You're going to need lots of room for your growing family. So to enlarge the tent says to let the curtains of your habitation be stretched out, the tent cloth which protects from sun, wind, and rain, and creates a canopy, a space for life and conviviality. To spread out, to enfold those who are on the outside but feel called to enter in. The ropes help to preserve the structure, provide balance. If the tent expands, the ropes must be stretched to maintain the right tension. And then drive the tent pegs deep. They anchor the structure to the ground and ensure its solidity. And yet they are portable. They can move when the tent needs to be pitched elsewhere. The image of the church as a tent is an evocative one, an expansive but not homogeneous dwelling, capable of sheltering all, but open, letting in and out, offering a place of safety and home to all of humanity. Enlarging the tent requires welcoming others into it, making room for their diversity. It requires an emptying of oneself, a kenosis, for the sake of the other. Migration is a global phenomenon that is changing the demographics of many of the world's countries. 250 million people today live in countries other than where they were born. 100 million have been displaced by war, drought, or political turmoil, and 42% of these are under the age of 18. Canada is taking steps to enlarge the site of our national tent by opening the doors to close to 500,000 immigrants per year. While most European and some Asian countries are experiencing population decline, Canada's population continues to grow at a rate of 1.4% per year. For the past 20 years, 70% of Canada's growth has come from immigration, not from the difference between births and deaths. The growth rate of foreign-born Canadians is 4 times larger than the growth rate of Canadian-born. In fact, relative to its population size, Canada is the largest importer of human capital in the group of 7 countries. The Conference Board of Canada has outlined reasons why immigration is important to Canada. 1, we have an aging workforce. The boomers are entering retirement, and we are a large group. Who's going to fund our Canada Pension Fund? We expect a longevity, lots of years of life ahead, collecting that pension. And so an aging workforce requires new and younger workers, a low fertility rate, and a commitment to humanitarian ideals and compassion. All these are good reasons why immigration is important. In the most recent national census of 2021, nearly 25% of Canadians identified themselves as foreign-born. And demographic trends project that by 2036, 30% of all Canadians will be immigrants. By comparison, only 14% of the US population is foreign-born. Toronto has just surpassed the 50% mark of its inhabitants being foreign-born, making it one of the world's most cosmopolitan and diverse cities. Vancouver is not far behind at 42%, but there are parts of Greater Vancouver like Richmond where it's 60%, and Burnaby, BC is 57%. In the 2021 census, Calgary registered 33%, and Edmonton 25% of its population being foreign-born. And the biggest shifts and patterns the biggest shift has been in the source of immigration. Whereas in the 20th century, by far the majority of immigrants were from European nations, today they are primarily from Asia. The top 10 countries of birth of recent immigrants are Philippines, India, China, Iran, Pakistan, USA, Syria, UK, France, and South Korea. At the end of the 20th century, sociologist Stephen Warner observed that immigrants represent not the de-Christianizing of American society, but the de-Europeanization of North American society. 41% of Calgarians, people from Calgary, were classified as visible minorities in the 2021 census. All these immigration trends point toward greater diversity in terms of religious affiliation and ethnicity. There's also an enormous opportunity for the church in Canada to benefit from immigration. Any church in one of Canada's urban centers that positions itself to receive and welcome newcomers should be growing. Even the most evangelistically aggressive conservative churches are winning very few converts in Canada. But immigration presents that unique opportunity. Birth rates of Roman Catholics and Protestants are very close to the national average of 1.6 per mother. So even if churches were to retain all the children born by their members, fancy that, their numbers would still decline. The National Trust for Canada estimated in 2019 that 9,000 church buildings in Canada will be repurposed or redeveloped by the end of this decade. Even as immigrants secure the survival of our Canada Pension Program, immigration is an important factor in the health and growth of the church in Canada. 43% of all immigrants coming to Canada identify as Christians, and they tend to be more devout than Canadian Christians. Younger new Canadians are almost 3 times as likely as Canadian-born residents of the same age to take part in religious services. In a study of church attendance patterns, the benchmark figure was attendance at a place of worship more than once a month. So the poll was conducted by Angus Reid and Reginald Bibby. Of those aged 18 to 49 born in Canada, 19% attended church at least more than once a month. Those born outside of Canada, 59%. Those born in Canada who were over 50, 25% attended church more than once a month. Those born outside of Canada, 34%. Is the Canadian church prepared to enlarge the tent of its site by integrating these newly arriving Christians and to offer them a spiritual home? At the same time, 33% of immigrants are Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists. The percentage of Canadians who identify themselves with non-Christian faiths is growing, while the percentage of Canadians affiliated with the historically dominant Christian denominations is shrinking. Also because the fastest growing category in Canada is non-religious. 34% declared themselves non-religious in the 2021 census, up from 24% in 2011, a dramatic increase. Brian McLaren characterizes Christianity as a sinking, shrinking ship of wrinkling people. So knowing how to interact with and befriend people of other faiths is no longer to be seen as a task for missionaries going overseas, but a challenge that each Christian needs to be equipped with through our local congregational help. Justin Bradbury, who wrote a wonderful essay on strangers within our gates, multiculturalism and mission in Canada, says, churches have supported immigrants through settlement assistance, English language training, and support for monoethnic church planting. However, most urban Protestant churches have not yet successfully integrated diaspora Christians into their worship and leadership communities. The prevalence of the monoethnic method of church planting raises vital questions about the future of missions in Canada's multi-ethnic cities. Is the church in Canada prepared to become truly a multicultural, inclusive community? Well, the Roman Catholic Church in Canada, by and large, has. It has changed dramatically as a result of immigration, particularly from Philippines, South Korea, India, and Latin America. Walk into any Roman Catholic parish in one of our larger urban centers, and you will immediately encounter a global, diverse community where whites are a minority. And not even just in great urban centers. My mother was born and raised in Trochu, Alberta, a town of about 1,000 people in central Alberta on the prairie. French Catholics settled this farming community, and then later on, German Baptists, which were my extraction, developed farms around the town. But a few years ago, a large meat packing plant was opened in town, attracting 24 Filipino families as workers. Their arrival has completely revitalized the Roman Catholic parish, which for a number of years was also led by a Nigerian priest. Hard to get your mind around that. You know, small town, rural Alberta, a Nigerian priest, Filipinos forming a large part of the Roman Catholic parish. A recent CBC survey of Roman Catholic parishes in Calgary found that in most of them, more than 50% of attendees are born outside of Canada. The decline in priestly vocations among Roman Catholics has resulted in the recruitment of many priests from Asia and Africa. One of my favorite friends is a priest at the Sacred Heart Parish of First Nations. It's a parish that specifically is contextualized for Indigenous peoples in inner city Edmonton. He's from India, from South India, and he has learned Cree in order to minister to them. Having pastors from other parts of the world makes the church appear more inclusive to newcomers. Edmonton's Catholic Newman Theological College offers a program of enculturation and orientation for the foreign-born priests who have come to serve in Canada. It's roughly a 4-week course of classroom and practical instruction on topics ranging from Canadian and First Nations culture and church history to practical things like how to enunciate while preaching in English. They spend 3-hour sessions on accent reduction exercise, or 7 3-hour sessions on accent reduction exercises. They learn to craft sermons that are brief, to the point, and include some humor. The enculturation program teaches about Canadian culture, church history, liturgical practice, as well as social topics such as appropriate personal space and behavior in a pastor that might turn Canadians off. Speakers also address sensitive topics such as gender roles in Canada, which may be different in a priest's home country, as well as racism, gender identification, and same-sex attraction. Since 2004, they have offered training to more than 300 priests from 22 different nations who are now serving in 17 different dioceses in Western Canada. Protestant denominations, many of which have ethnic roots in specific European nations, have been far less successful in reaching our new multicultural reality. We must take into account the barriers that exist and that we perpetuate. Some of these are social-cultural and economic structures that benefit the wealthy and educated, expensive youth activities that are prohibitive for people on limited income, relocation of church buildings to cheaper land on the outskirts of the city in areas not served by public transit, or our insensitivity to and unwillingness to resource those who have special needs. My sister is the minister to children in a Baptist church here in Edmonton, and she writes, our church received an email from a family that had just moved to Edmonton, asking if their family, which included a nonverbal autistic child using a wheelchair, would be welcomed. Our immediate response was, we warmly welcome you. Then we needed to figure out how we would do this in the best possible way. A few months later, a family arrived at the church asking if we would accommodate their child who has Down syndrome, or if they would have to take turns being present with the child in children's ministry. At this point, we already had a special needs volunteer assisting the autistic child. She then became designated to integrate both of these two children. The family was pleasantly surprised and commented that as a couple, they had not been able to worship together for years. A few later, to our surprise, we were nominated and awarded the Community Inclusion Award from Inclusion Alberta. And this is the picture of them receiving the award, presented to McKernan Baptist Church. Sadly, I comment, it was the first time a church had received this award. So pictured are the mom who nominated the church on the left, the special needs volunteer, and my sister, Geraldine Bayer, the children's pastor. Our lack of vision leads to a lack of appropriate structures and ways of accompanying persons with special needs. We must find new ways of welcoming their contribution and promoting their participation. Despite the frequent encounters between Jesus and people with special needs, the church is in danger of imitating the way society casts them out. The most frequently excluded groups are the poorest, the lonely elderly, Indigenous peoples, migrants, street children, alcoholics, drug addicts, those caught up in criminal gangs, sex workers, victims of trafficking, survivors of abuse, groups who suffer discrimination and violence because of race, ethnicity, gender, culture, and sexuality. Every society has individuals or groups who find themselves at the margins. A few years ago, I was teaching theology of mission in Siberia to a class of 22 Russian students. Now, I will make a disclaimer here. This is not the picture of my class. I found this on the internet. This is a class of students in the same city in Omsk, university students. My students were more mature than this, and they looked a lot rougher. Of those 22 students that I had, a number of them had served prison sentences for drug trafficking and now were involved in prison ministry and church planting. I combed my files. I spent hours looking for the pictures and to scan them into this presentation, could not find them. I wish I could, because I had some students who were covered with tattoos. One of them, he even had his eyelids tattooed. I didn't know it was possible to tattoo your eyelids. So it was a fascinating group of people who had lived a rough life, come to new faith in Christ, and now were involved in prison ministry and church planting. There was a flourishing ministry to the hearing impaired people in their church. So I was teaching theology of mission and talking about the imperative to reach the marginalized. And one of the students timidly raised their hand and said, "We do not have marginalized people here. Communism has placed all of us on an equal footing." But I had been there only for about 10 days so far, but been there long enough to observe that there were Muslim traders from Kazakhstan who came every week to sell their goods in the market. And driving on the outskirts of the city, I saw settlements of Roma people. So I challenged them, and they had to admit that they had become blind to the others who were in their own midst. Nadia Bolz-Weber reminds us that we should not expect others to change in order to fit under our tent. Our job is to extend the roof so they can fit. The tent is not ours, it's God's tent. Enlarging the tent is at the heart of our missional activity, because it springs from the very heart of God. The final image I want to share with you revolves around the difference between offering hospitality and providing home. When we welcome people to our homes for an evening of conversation and sharing food together, we might tell them to make yourself at home as a way of helping them relax. We encourage them to feel free to ask if they need a drink or need something, but we don't usually mean what we say. We still expect them to perform the roles appropriate to a guest, while we exercise the role of hosts. We want the guests to enjoy our company, the comforts of our house, the food we offer, but we really don't want them to adjust the thermostat on the wall, to rearrange our furniture, to make suggestions on how to improve our decor, or ask if they can pick out a bottle of wine for our dinner from our wine cellar. We would not take kindly to advice on how to manage our household finances or suggestions on how to improve the health of our diet. These are personal matters that we want to exercise control over. I fear that most churches are quite willing to offer hospitality to newcomers or to those who are different, but we want to preserve this distinction between hosts and guests. Even in the warmest welcome, there are issues of power. The one who welcomes has the power to decide whether to extend welcome and, secondly, to set the ground rules of the welcome. As churches, either denominations or local congregations, commit to becoming intercultural, they need to contemplate a more radical notion of welcome. We must move beyond the notion of hospitality to one of providing home. Rather than always being on the side of welcoming the other, we might also want to ask ways or seek ways in which we can be welcomed into the lives of the other. How might our churches, instead of saying, "You are welcome at our house," say, "I must stay at your house today"? We are called to go to every place, especially outside the more familiar territories. The German study group of the Synodal Council that was studying this particular text on extending the tent says, leaving the comfortable position of those who give hospitality to allow ourselves to be welcomed into the existence of those who are our companions on the journey of humanity is the direction we need to go. Amador Hojo Remigio, he's a Filipino-Canadian who has pastored diaspora communities in Vancouver, laments that the church has been captive to its cultural ways, ethnocentric biases, pastoral insensitivity to migration realities. These realities demand a kingdom-minded missional response. It requires moving beyond a mere church-based tokenism that centers around the extension of hospitality to an approach that reflects the compassionate heart of God in concrete, practical, and holistic ways, resonating with the multifaceted needs and legitimate aspirations of migrants and their families in Canada. While we may be keen to reflect the diversity of our increasingly multicultural communities, are we prepared to do so with equity and genuine inclusion? Diversity is measured by who is present. Varieties of ethnicities, ages, socioeconomic status, gender identities, and sexual orientations. Equity is measured by who has access to a community's resources and on what terms. Who are the leaders? Whose dreams for the community set the agenda? Who are those who hold power and influence? Inclusion speaks to the sense of welcome and belonging extended to each person or group. In a very concrete way, Robert Sellers, the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan, compares diversity, equity, and inclusion to a dance. He says, diversity is where everyone is invited to the party. Equity means that everyone gets to contribute to the playlist. Inclusion means that everyone has the opportunity to dance. The mere presence of diversity does not produce inclusion. Hospitality does not always lead to providing home. If a church desires diversity, that is an important and biblical goal, but it is only part of the kingdom goal. Jamar Tisby, in his wonderful book, How to Fight Racism, notes that too many people of color have entered majority white spaces only to find that they are valued for their presence, but not their perspective. A couple of years ago, I served on the doctoral committee at Knox College, University of Toronto, for Jonathan Schmidt, who is currently the Associate Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches in the area of intercultural leadership. It was a brilliant dissertation. In his dissertation, he offered this thought, which I will share in closing. He highlighted the gift of the newcomer and cited the example of John the Baptist, who recognized the visitor as being a gift. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Imagine if churches saw visitors in this way. The welcome would not be, come, be part of us and accept what we have to offer. It would be, your arrival is a gift. Come, share what you have to offer us. Come and change us. And that was exactly 1 hour. Thank you for hanging there with me.
So I'm just going to say a brief thank you for a moment to Dr. Effa. Suggest that we take a 1-minute stretch break here for the group of people that have been sitting, and then we're going to come back and see if you folks have a few questions. How's that? So we'll just do a 1-minute stretch here, and then we'll be back with some questions for you. And you people at home can take a break too. Let's stretch.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. That last business. We're working. Susan and I are working. How many got online? Can I speak in French? No, but a lot of talk for us. That's good. Yeah, this is all around the clock.
This part is
Okay, all the chat is outside. Come on, all the chat is outside here. Okay, we're going to take our seats again. Hello. All right, here we go. Here's all those chatters from outside. off on us.
Somebody wrong for other breaks. Herding
Yes.
herding cats.
John, Churchill, bring those chatters in for me, those people that are outside, bring them in. Good heavens, we're holding up other people.
Yes, that's true.
Yes. Okay. So let's go back to our gentleman, David, who has control of that machine there. So thank you for that information. It's very educational. I love the definitions. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here to see if they have any questions. And then I'm going to alternate between the online folks and the folks that are present here in the building. So is there anybody presently in front of me who has a question they'd like to ask? Okay. Okay, this gentleman. Sorry, I don't read.
I'll ask a question. Most of our churches in rural Nova Scotia do reflect the racial, cultural background of the communities they're in. Very different from urban centers that you're talking about. The two groups that are excluded in most of our rural Nova Scotia churches are by and large minimum wage workers who work in the service industry, and because we have full-time 7-day week shopping now, are busy on Sundays working, and also young families who are busy with their kids in sports activities. And so I wonder, does the Sunday morning worship time by itself become exclusionary?
Well, I think we can thank COVID for having broken that barrier down. Certainly a lot of people are accessing worship services remotely at the times that they appreciate. Even some of our smaller churches continue to offer live streaming or record their services. I'm personally a great believer in the importance of physically gathering together as a community. And I wonder how well people who are purely watching services online can truly sense being part of the body of Christ and be part of an inclusive community in the flesh and blood sharing table kind of way that we see so evident in this in the scriptures. It might certainly cause some questions about how can we meet at a different time as a community that accommodates these various needs. But I appreciate the fact that you have eyes to see that there are, even in a mono-ethnic community, there are those who are excluded because of occupation or time or just stage of life, who find it difficult to be integrated into the community. There's a non-answer, but
Okay, somebody online have a question?
I'll jump. Yeah. So I appreciate, Alan, that you said there are no magic formulas or steps that you can take. But as a church that is experiencing a lot more diversity these days with the many new Canadians coming, I recognize that we're on the diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're very much in the diversity stage of our life, right? We're not in the equity and inclusion part when it comes to new Canadians. Are there churches in Canada that you can point to that are worth that are maybe further on that journey of equity and inclusion, that are also coming out of a tradition like the church I serve that is fully inclusive of our LGBTQ community and sees that inclusion tent being very wide? So just be curious if there are places that we can learn from as we try to apply that to our own settings.
They are few and they are rare, especially with the parameters that you have drawn. I can think of churches in my own city that were planted specifically as intercultural churches, but they do not extend the tent as widely as you have suggested. An example that I can share, and this is more of a secondhand, but I sent a link to you. I want to share that with everybody. Is a remarkable story of Knox United Church in Winnipeg, an inner city church. Of course, it has the United tradition, but they took steps to deliberately seek to become a church of inclusion, not only in terms of sexual orientation and genders, but also towards the world around them, the nations around them, and have very successfully turned around a diminishing, shrinking, wrinkling group of people to a church that has become a flourishing congregation. And the stories that Bill Miller shares, he was the pastor who kind of was brought in to bring this turnaround about, are very, very worthwhile listening to on his podcasts. And they're very well developed. It's called Open Out. And if you email me, I can send you, any of you, a link to those podcasts, but a delightful, thoughtful, progressive story of how they made deliberate steps. The biggest challenge moving from diversity to equity and equality, or equity and then inclusion, is power. We love the way things are. In fact, increasingly we love going to church because it's a familiar place. We know the liturgy. We're comfortable with how things are done. We don't want anybody to mess up our comfortable space. And to begin to really seek equity and invite others to be involved in the playlist, there are worship leaders and musicians who might balk at that. But to truly, include greater sources of worship, music from around the world, where you can begin to sing the songs of the global community of Christ. It's just such an important part of enriching and making everybody feel like there's a home there. And then giving up leadership, and being forthright in identifying people and bringing them into leadership who are from other communities. I'll give one example. One of my favorite guys I bring in on my church planting courses is Dr. Sam Owusu, a Ghanaian church planter of Calvary Worship Center in Surrey, BC. It's probably the largest intercultural church in Canada, but they were having a difficult time attracting people of Korean ethnicity. For some reason, they would come and they would go, they would not return the next Sunday. And so one Sunday, there was a Korean fellow who showed up, and when he met him at the door, he says, "I would like you to join our worship team." Before Sam had even asked the rest of the worship team. And so he said, "Okay, I'm interested." So they had him come and join for the rehearsal. The guy couldn't sing a tune for any kind of help. So they just turned his microphone down really, really low. And it was a catalyst, because sure enough, in the next few Sundays, people started coming, people of Asian background, but particularly Koreans, saw that there was somebody like them on the platform. And that was all they needed to know. Oh, this place can be home for me as well. So it's a cute story of taking a risk, of sharing power that led to the kind of result they were looking for.
Great. Good story. Anybody else in front of me here have a question, comment? David.
Hi, Alan. Thanks very much for that presentation. The question I have kind of flips it maybe a little bit on its head. I'm thinking particularly of the Anglican Church experience in the United Kingdom, where, the Anglican Church's British theology on questions of, say, gender and sexuality has separated it quite substantially from, say, the Anglican Church in Africa, to the point now where there's a schism developing in the synod. So if we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in, say, congregations in North America or in Europe, but what if there is a fundamental difference in terms of the immigrant experience of their church and the immigrant experience in churches in North America? Say, you use the example of the Catholic Church. And in many ways, the Catholic Church has an advantage because, with a few minor exceptions, its theology is pretty much stamped globally. But for churches that are Baptist or that are Anglican or Presbyterian, there are schisms that can develop. So how do we deal with those?
Oh my! I was afraid.
Easy question.
We like you.
We could all pool all of our wisdom in the room here, and I don't think we'd come up with a proper answer to that. Inevitably, there are certain convictions that around which our churches are formed that are going to create those separating points. Even if it's equality of men and women in ministry, there are certain people coming from different cultural backgrounds, even in our own society, who are going to balk at that and say, oh, this is not a church where I'm feeling comfortable. So yes, there are certain theological convictions, moral justice convictions that we cannot compromise as a church. And yet I know that there are people from all the nations who resonate with that and are looking for that kind of freedom, that kind of more of a progressive take on faith. But yes, it will not appeal to everyone. And there will be some who will simply walk away and say that church is not a place where I can find home. But it will not be because of being exclusive in terms of ethnicity, but simply because of convictions on matters of justice.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, you have one question?
I'd just like to offer a comment based on experiences that we had here over 25 or 30 years, where we went from a situation where people in the different denominations rarely, if ever, had any activities that they did in another church or ever even go into another church. And so when that started to be overcome, we all had to figure out, think of the onion. We all had to figure out what is it that's actually not negotiable. And I remember first time I met a Methodist who was very skeptical of the virgin birth. And, you know, that's a pretty popular idea among Roman Catholics like myself. And my brother-in-law, who's a little bit more flexible because he's Spanish Italian, and so I'm upset. I'm telling him, you know, this is really too much. Like, I'm trying to become to know this fellow better, and you know, we really hit a roadblock. And he looks at me and he says, virgin birth. Is it really that important? And I don't think I had ever answered that question before, but he just looked at me and said, I thought what you guys were doing was planning a breakfast program over at the grade school. And it kind of threw it into perspective that I had to just decide for myself, was I going to work with this Methodist who doesn't believe something that up to that point I thought was like, this is bedrock. Say, well, it isn't really that bedrock. And I think the challenge we all have for the next 20 years is, I'll put it to you in the words of a friend of mine who's a very good bishop. I asked him straight out, do you still all believe, do you believe all of the articles of the creed that we say at Mass every week? And he said, yes, but there's only 5 of them I'd die for. and I think that that's where we all are. We've got this basket of principles, but we got to ask ourselves when we start talking with people who are Muslims, okay, it's not as if they don't respect Jesus. They do respect Jesus, but we have to ask ourselves, okay, you know, just what is the core? What is the real core for us when we say we are Christians, or when I say I am a Catholic Christian or I'm a Baptist Christian? And my own suspicion is that the list we have in our heads is way bigger than it needs to be. And we have to deal with, that's what we're going to have to deal with, or this is not going anywhere in the long run.
Good comment. Thank you. How about online? Is there anybody who has a question? A final question? Is that Aaron Kenny?
Yeah, hi there.
Yeah,
Can you hear
hi.
me okay?
Right, yes.
Yep.
I think in Atlantic Canada, probably one of a very common experience, certainly here in Bridgewater, is that we've been very welcoming as churches and as a community to see newcomers coming in and through our communities. But the challenge is people don't stay. They come for education, for training, to land, and then the gravity or the pull is to move to an urban center to meet with a larger group of the diaspora. So they have relatives in Montreal, or they have relatives in Toronto, or wherever it might be. And so it's almost a passing through. But even for those who do stay, there is that deep sense of we want to protect our identity and our culture and our background. And so there, even in our community, there's a small community of people from Pakistan who are together, and they're often doing activities in our park, and and even have held some gatherings at our church in our facility. But the challenge is trying to make a connection, as you're saying, not to be welcoming, but to actually have them feel at home. But just as you said, that for us as European descent Christians, that relationship will transform us. There will be things we will let go of and new things we will take on. I imagine the same challenge is on the other side of that experience as well. What am I giving up if I become a member, or if I become a part of this? This becomes my new home. Have you any experience around that, or how to help, just as much as we want to, as pastors and as leaders, help our congregations to change a mindset and to be more open for a bigger vision of a widening tent? Any recommendations for how we engage maybe some of those enclaves in our own communities, or those families who feel very threatened by the idea?
Wow. Yeah. How can the church have the resources and be able to provide that kind of training and even practical helps on how to establish conversations with people who are different, who come from different parts of the world, offering hospitality? What is it like to invite a Muslim neighbor into your home for a meal, and what kind of protocols could you suggest for them? There's a huge amount of intercultural training, which has been my whole life career at seminary, that I wonder how can be transferred to the local church. People are not even skilled at meeting new people who are like them in many cases, and they're afraid that you might reach out to the people who look like them. So sometimes basic skills on how to meet and greet new people, what kinds of conversation to ask beyond when did you come to Canada and what's your favorite food or whatever, but how to have deep and meaningful conversations are things that we could work on training our congregations with. One thing that even bringing in people from other faiths to talk with our groups, let's say a Pakistani Muslim, come and ask them to come and talk about their faith, their experience of coming to Canada, and their practice of their faith is a way to just help bring down fear and stereotypes and those kind of barriers. Are wonderful ways to help people feel more confident in relating to those who are different. Let me share one story about a church here in Edmonton that recently took some significant steps toward diversification. It's Steel Heights Baptist Church in the northeast part of the city. It was a German Baptist church that became more and more diverse over the decades because the community became very intercultural. But then a year and a half ago, an East African church church plant of East Africans began to approach Steel Heights about a merger. They were finding that their resources were few. Their young people were becoming more and more Canadian, didn't like being in youth group just with their own kids, and the pastoral staff was finding itself quite stretched. And so after a lot of prayer and deliberation, the two churches became one. The two African pastors came on staff at Steel Heights, became co-leaders, and shared the sermon, the preaching responsibilities, worship team participation. It completely changed the dynamics of that particular church. But sometimes, as that Pakistani group matures and as they move along, you continue to develop that friendship. They might become an integral part of your church and find a home with you if you can make those kind of accommodations.
Great. Okay, well, I want to thank the folks here and the folks online for questions, and Alan, for you for being a good sport and wanting to field all those. I'm going to turn it over to Erica Kenny, who's going to give an official thanks on our behalf. Okay, Erica.
Just so much to think about, and our troops are definitely being challenged today and going into the future. And what you've shared has given us just so much to reflect on and to put into action in our congregations. And it's been really weighing on me lately that, you know, our church in particular, our tagline is everyone is welcome here. And for the longest time, I felt, do we really mean that? And in the heart of hearts, I know that we don't. And so how do we go from using a tagline like everyone is welcome here to people just feeling like they're at home? And that's, it's proving to be a difficult journey. And just, I've taken a lot away from your talk today and things to maybe try to implement and to share with our church and our community. And so I just want to say thank you so much for your words and just for taking the time to share with us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, everybody. I'm just going to turn it over for the last few minutes to Marlene. We've got a bit of business meeting.
Yes, please don't leave. Online or in person. Only a few moments. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who took part today. Lead, Arla, David, John, all this work. David, thank you. Bob, so many people put so much into this, so thank you very much. The ladies, the cooks, I don't know where they are, but hey, there's one. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts and from our stomachs. It was very, very good. Lunch was wonderful. So I wanted to begin with thank you. This is a CABF brief business meeting. So all members are welcome to please stay. Let's start with prayer. Lord God, we gather our hearts and our thoughts and our minds in order to make a couple of decisions. And oh Lord, we just ask for your guidance and your wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. We have two motions on the floor, and this is the exciting part of being part of CABF in this day and age. We are in conversation with a number of churches across Canada, and we have had the pleasure of getting to meet and know and talk with some of these individuals, these churches that are struggling in their areas, their journey, and they would like to have a home, a safe home or a place to call home, and CABF has been their choice. So today we are going to make a motion to accept the Church of South Point in Surrey, BC, to the membership of CABF. And I'm going to call on either David Allen or Rusty Edwards. David is the membership chair and Rusty is the credentials chair. If they would like to speak to any of those or make the motion. I just need someone to make a motion.
Rusty.
I'm happy to move. Very happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Rusty. Okay, we have a motion on the floor to accept the Church of South Point, Surrey, BC, to CABF. And okay, Hugh Kierkegaard has seconded it. Now we can speak about it. Rusty, would you like to say something about this church at all?
I will just say, I think a few of us have had opportunity to get to especially know Ann Smith, who is the minister there. I know Marlene and a few others have joined. And in fact, the chair of their council spent an afternoon, I believe, with Marlene in person at her place.
Yes.
And I'll say both to them and to Kits, who we'll talk about in a little bit. I am thrilled that we can be a welcoming home. I think CABF is in the midst of expanding our tent right now. And I know from text I'm receiving from friends out west that today has not been a day for them of seeing those tent pegs extended. And I'm glad that we can be a home, and together we can figure out what that means to be truly not only diverse in our national landscape, but how we become more equitable and inclusive as we become a national body truly.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments that you'd like to make at this point in time before we take the vote?
Let's vote.
Okay. Oh, David?
Just to, before David Gibson does this, to make sure that we have a quorum.
David Gibson?
He's there.
Do we have a quorum?
Yes, I would suggest that we do have a quorum. I spent some time with David Allen and the past year. I think it's exactly how we could calculate quorum. And I've been keeping a very close eye on how many the meeting and how many the online and the entire exceed as it.
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Thank you. Okay. We have a quorum. All right, we've asked for the vote. All in favor of accepting the Church of South Point?
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Welcome, South Point. Now, the next one, we need a motion to accept Kitsilano Christian Community Church of Vancouver, BC. So I'd like to have a motion put forth. All right, Ed Cahoon, and we need a seconder, John Boyd. And Rusty, did you want to say anything about Kits?
And not say, you know, like I said, again, a community, I think we're going to enjoy getting to know that community.
Yes, very much. Okay, are we, any more comments or questions from the, all right, the vote?
Ready.
All right, all in favor of accepting Kitsilano Christian Community Church of Vancouver to a CABF?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Oh, I didn't ask for any contrary minded. There's what?
David Gibson.
David Gibson, you had a question?
Oh, no.
No, okay.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, David. Okay, so were there any people who, yes, wanted to say nay to any of this? We have to record that if there is, that's all. No, and I don't think there was. Thank you very much. Our next members meeting, full members from across Canada everywhere, will be September the 29th in the evening, and that'll be our AGM. And then the event of the book presentation on Saturday will be the next day. And so we will see all of you there, and we will have an exciting summer in the meantime. All right. God bless you. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody online, and thank you everybody in person.
Thank you,
Amen.
guys.
Thanks. Bye.